Welcome back to Be Real Talks. I'm Sophia Givry. Today we are joined with Dr. Albert Fu. Albert received a PhD in sociology from Binghamton University in 2009. Currently, he is a full professor of sociology at Kutztown University of Pennsylvania, which is about an hour and a half outside of Philadelphia. In addition to Kutztown University, Albert has been a visiting lecturer overseas, specifically in Turkey and Ethiopia. His areas of interest are environmental and urban sociology. Today, we're going to be speaking with Albert about his experience navigating the model minority myth and just his general experience working abroad. Thank you so much for joining us today, Albert.
Thanks.
So my first question for you is, can you talk to us a little bit about how your identity or your personal experience influenced your decision to pursue academia?
Well, I can't say that at least my racial identity, being Asian American, drew me specifically to sociology. In fact, I actually chose sociology over history for a PhD program because I thought it'd be more flexible. That said, in terms of my personal experiences, I think growing up in California definitely played a significant role in shaping what I do. So growing up, I saw postmodern urbanism, urban development, and wildfire firsthand, and that's really influenced my academic pursuits in recent years. So that's what I've been writing a lot about.
Yeah, that really does explain it, right? I feel like that would draw someone to environmentalism, kind of dealing with it firsthand. And then, so for those of you who are unfamiliar with the model minority myth, that is a myth that is very much rooted in stereotypes associated with Asian populations. These stereotypes are, Asians are good at math, they're smart, they're polite, mild-mannered, rule-following kinds of people. And the reason this myth is damaging is because, first of all, it doesn't really capture the diversity amongst Asian communities. And second of all, it creates a lot of unrealistic expectations. So Albert, you can add to kind of how you see the model minority myth, and then can you kind of talk to us about how, you've kind of encountered the model minority myth in the workplace?
Well, over the course of my career, I've certainly experienced a lot of microaggressions over the course of my career. So, I mean, in terms of microaggressions, it's a lot of just things that are said offhandedly that might not necessarily be outright racist, but definitely remind me that maybe I don't fit in a particular setting. So, for example, one thing that I kind of regularly run into is that people forget that Asians are actually minorities. In fact, I've actually heard from some folks that Asians can't claim minority status because we're overrepresented on college campuses and have high median incomes. So, of course, those are really, they're stereotypes. Indeed, at my school, for example, Asians are overrepresented in faculty, but actually severely underrepresented in the student body, partially because we're in Pennsylvania, unlike New York or California or some other states where Asians are overrepresented. However, when I step off campus, it's a very different, very undiverse world. So definitely, there's no doubt whatsoever that I am a minority, especially living in a state like Pennsylvania. Also, assumptions about Asian American income, of course, are highly problematic, and you kind of hinted at that just a moment ago. Of course, median incomes vary significantly based on country of origin or nationality of different Asian ethnic groups. And so in many cities across the United States, you actually see Asian American communities have extremely high poverty rates. Other things that are, of course, really frustrating, every so often I get mistaken for another Asian faculty member. Of course, like every so often, of course, this isn't just an Asian thing. Other people of color deal with this people think we all look alike when obviously we don't.
Yeah, and that I definitely, even what you said, I get that even as a white person, right? Of, oh, Asians are they really a minority? So that kind of question does come up a lot. And can you talk about how this kind of myth has impacted workplace dynamics or your career path?
Well, something you hinted at about Asians maybe not necessarily being the most outspoken. Certainly, I do wonder if, like, the flack that I get when I speak up is heightened because they don't expect the Asian guy to constantly sort of criticize what's going on. So I do sort of wonder about that sometimes. In terms of my general sort of career, I can say that quantitatively speaking, I can say that I have had to do much more than some of my senior white counterparts to earn tenure and promotion. This means more publishing work and as well as more service work. And this is something you find with faculty of color all over. Now, oftentimes we have to do a lot more service work because we're the ones reaching out to our students of color. But at the same time, this kind of reflects a general sort of trend in higher ed. Junior faculty are on average more diverse than senior faculty. Of course, even to despite that, higher ed can do much better. In most universities, the faculty demographics don't come anywhere close to matching that of the student body. And of course, so going back to the idea of the sort of issues that more junior, younger faculty have to deal with, we all came out of a much more intense job market in which publish to perish is now like on steroids times 100. It's absolutely sort of ridiculous. So that said, I can't say that anything specific to the model minority myth in regards to that. In the sense that I do think all of us more junior people have to do a lot more. But I do wonder if I didn't do everything that I had to do, would I have been able to get tenure and promotion as easily as some of those folks more senior than me?
Yeah, and I like how you also mentioned just that general shift that's taken place in academia, and that's made it so difficult for junior faculty to really just get paid what they deserve and all that kind of stuff. So kind of broadening this out a little bit, you've worked in Turkey, you've worked in the US and Ethiopia. Have you noticed any distinctions from country to country in the ways that you've been treated for aspects of your identity, such as, your nationality or anything along those lines?
Well, in general, being Asian American and traveling overseas is kind of interesting. In other countries, people sometimes forget that the United States is actually a pretty diverse place, and much more diverse than just white folks, or maybe including African Americans. So as an Asian American, people usually just kind of assume that I'm Asian. Of course, I'm not necessarily blaming people. For example, in Turkey, there are a lot of there are a lot of Chinese tourists that definitely end up in the big cities. In Ethiopia, there are just a lot of Chinese companies operating there, doing a number of different sort of things. So it takes a while for people to process that I'm actually an American. So that's kind of an interesting sort of experience, just broadly when I travel. But teaching overseas has actually been a really good experience for me. Just like in the United States, when I teach, I learn a lot from my students. And so definitely I learn a lot from my students over there. And I would have to say I learn about culture, I learn about food, I learn about just a very, very different sort of different communities, right? That said, teaching sociology specifically overseas is also really interesting. So, just the simple fact that I'm an Asian American, kind of the product of a diaspora, teaching overseas, leads to some very interesting discussions. So I'm in both countries, I'm actually teaching in English. And so just the fact that I'm teaching in English, there's a lot to unpack there. So there's discussions to be had about globalization, power, hegemony, knowledge, just a long list of things that have actually made it, once again, a really, really positive experience.
Yeah, and I think it's great how you mentioned how you're teaching them, but you've been able to learn from those experiences as well, right? So kind of immersing yourself into cultures that you didn't grow up with or are kind of a little bit unfamiliar to you. I think it's important because a lot of the times I feel like people kind of are resistant to doing that or kind of, really kind of silo themselves off with individuals that are more like them.
Yeah.
So kind of looking at, your personal experiences, do you have any advice for students that are kind of really struggling with these stereotypes that are associated with them? Maybe they are talking to friends and their friends are kind of judging them, because they're not good at math or they're not good at certain areas or career paths that are expected of them.
Yeah, I mean, for one thing, I'll say I'm not a quantitative researcher, and my math skills definitely could use some work. So like, that's definitely breaking the stereotype right there. I mean, career-wise, definitely, I think it's really important to follow your passions or at least be interested in whatever you're working on, right? Career-wise, I don't study Asia or Asian Americans. I can't say I've really felt direct pressure to work in those areas, but there have been situations where there's kind of this expectation that that's what I'm actually doing, right? So there's a stereotype that's going on there. Recently, in some circles, there's been sort of this thing in which white academics have actually criticized scholars of color, also women as well, who engage in so-called me search, or in other words, people of color, women, and so forth, only do work that's autobiographical. Of course, that's really hypocritical because, of course, white academics have studied, let's say, American and European history for like forever. So definitely, there are a lot of there's stereotypes going on there. There's a lot of hypocrisy going on there. But I think kind of core to that is, of course, we all have different aspects to ourselves. And of course, a lot of different sort of things that interest us. Being Asian American is just one part of my identity. It's a very important part, but it's just one part. And, we started off this conversation with me kind of saying that I'm from California and that influenced my research. And, the interesting sort of thing is that, writing about California wildfires, for example, for a lot of people, it doesn't come across as me search the same way that, studies of race and gender come across, despite my deep attachment to in my hometown and my home state and so forth. But kind of like just going back to the idea of advice, I have been successful working in that area because I do have a personal connection to that research as well as a passion. And I think for pretty much every field, that's really, really important in terms of finding success. Because if you're going to have to stick to something for a long period of time, hopefully you actually like what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, academia is definitely a field where you're able to do that for sure. So my last question for you is, looking back on your experience, what is one or two things that you wish someone would have pulled you aside, said, hey, Albert, this is what you should really be aware of that will help prepare you after graduating college?
Oh man, that's a really tough one. I think one thing is don't be afraid to change course. I actually only came to studying environmental issues a little bit later in my career. In fact, it was until after I graduated from Binghamton and about a year out, I realized that there were some interesting things from my previous research that I just had touched upon but didn't really sort of get into. And I think that's a big thing, not just in terms of academic research, but life in general. You never know what sort of twists and turns your life and your career might take. And I think that means it's important to keep an open mind, right? I think, gosh, when I was like a third-year grad student and somebody said, oh, you're going to be writing about like environmental issues, I would be like, oh, really? Like I couldn't have imagined, right? So I think that's one thing that would have been nice to kind of hear, that yes, passion and being interested in something is important, but it's also important to kind of broaden your horizons and keep an open mind.
Yeah, I think that's really important too, especially for the students that got kind of really set on what their future should look like, having that insight and being dynamic. So, well, I think you had some really great things to say in terms of, your kind of, it's on whoever it is, it's on you to really figure out which aspect of your identity is most important to you and kind of shaping your career path. You did a nice example of how people would assume, or sometimes people assume that you would study some kind of Asian oriented research, but actually what you feel very connected to is, growing up in California and that sort of thing. So, having students know that they really have power over their own identities in that way. So thank you so much for talking to us today.
Oh, thanks.
And to all the students watching, I will see you on the next one.